thank you for taking the time to listen to today's episode. As you know, the current crisis in Myanmar is extremely concerning, and we appreciate that you're taking time to stay informed. There is even value just in becoming more aware and helping to inform others. So please consider sharing this episode so that more people may learn about what is really happening in the country. It's critical to ensure that this issue remains present in public discourse. Now, let's get to the interview itself. Nic Dunlop, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Inside Myanmar podcast.
Okay. I've been based here for, nearly 35 years in Bangkok, but working in the region mainly, to begin with, in Cambodia. I spent many years working there. And in between forays to Cambodia, I would go to Burma as well. But I've worked in places like India and Nepal and Papua New Guinea and elsewhere. But my main focus, as I say, has been Cambodia and Burma.
Right, and when was your first trip to Burma?
Well, my first trip to Burma proper would be 1995, just after Aung San Suu Kyi was released from her first term under house arrest. But actually, I'd been to Burma across the border from Thailand into Karen State in 1992 was the first time.
And going across the border in 92 and then into the country proper in 95, what were your early impressions of the country?
I was very ignorant. I knew very little about Burma. The reason I actually went the first time was mainly because of curiosity, but primarily because I ran out of money in Bangkok, and the Jesuits, the Jesuit Refugee Service, had offered me a place to stay, or a free bed, and in the compound where they were living, where they had their base, there was a handful of Burmese exiled students from the 88 uprising in Burma, and we became friends. And I realized that, by accident of birth, had I been born in Rangoon, I may well have been among them, and actually it was this group of Burmese guys who set up the Irrawaddy, what later became the Irrawaddy magazine. So the very first issue of the Irrawaddy was illustrated with my photographs. I made a trip.
Well, this was Aung San?
Yeah, it was Aung San. So I made a trip with another Burmese student who's now in Australia, but we went to the border, we went to ABSDF camps, we went to Karen camps, KNU controlled areas. So yeah, I think it's only a 2-week trip, but it was, it was long enough. So I got a sense of it, but I didn't understand much about Burma. It seemed to be another world. All I came across were, in terms of picture-wise, were these refugee camps and guerrillas or insurgents in the forest, and we went up and down the Moy River and the Salaween River as well. And so it was really no sense of any context for me, and that sparked my interest. I felt sort of profoundly out of place, and I felt I needed to understand and learn more. So it was a starting point was really the student uprising of 1988, and meeting these guys who had fled. That really set me off to try and sort of get a deeper understanding of what Burma meant, what it was about, and why they were where they were.
That's incredible. So you're backpacking in Thailand, run out of money, end up at a hostel. where the people at the hostel is Aung San and other members of 88 who you then go with into these guerrilla camps.
I came out to base myself in town because I wanted to work as a photographer. So it was in the process of setting myself up here. I primarily come to Cambodia, and I didn't want to base myself there. It was still fairly unstable, and I felt like Bangkok had everything I needed as a photographer. In those days, it was all analog, which meant you needed proper processing facilities. And Bangkok is a good place for a respite from places like Cambodia. So it was in the process of starting, if you like, some sort of I guess what you might call a career in photography or photojournalism that I became interested in Burma. So it was sort of, there was a purpose there. It wasn't aimless sort of wandering around, checking stuff out,
But it was extraordinary serendipity to come in contact with someone who would become the editor of a leading independent media outlet, and in fact to accompany him on a photojournalist expedition where your pictures end up in the first issue of an outlet that still is going strong today.
Yeah, I guess so. Looking back on it, I mean, for me, Aung San was just Aung San. Somebody that I knew from. We would sit out in the evenings. We were in this compound of several houses. So one was JRS, the Jesuit Refugee Service, and next door to us was Bertel Lintner and his wife Seng Nong. So we used to congregate around the pool, and there was where we would drink cheap Thai whiskey, sit with Bertel and Aung San and a few others, and just talk into the night. So that's how. Yeah, it's funny how these things begin.
Yeah, one can only imagine if there had been a recording of those conversations, that'd be...
I don't think they'd be that interesting. I mean, I knew nothing.
Well, at least Bertel and Aung San, it'd be quite a podcast feed today to be able to put out there. But so your first experience was then taking must have been a remarkable trip into these guerrilla camps and seeing the resistance at that time, while you don't necessarily have the extensive background as to what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't like that. I didn't feel comfortable with that at all, because I knew a lot about Cambodia at that stage. I'd really done a lot of homework. That was the whole purpose of me coming out here in the first place. So I felt, on sure ground when it came to Cambodia, in many respects, perhaps not everything, obviously, but with Burma, it really was a position of great ignorance that I started. And like I say, it was that immediate connection. This is my generation. While these guys were being shot at in the streets of places like Rangoon by the military, I was at school as well. So it was that kind of connection probably more than anything. But anyway, it started me off on a journey to really trying to get to grips to understand what was going on in Burma, and how these young guys had ended up here in Bangkok in exile. So yeah.
And then several years later, you go to Rangoon, I presume, or Yangon. The name had been changed by then. And so what were your impressions of that trip?
Well, like I say, I was full of, 1988. I mean, I was looking for any signs of anything that what we would call oppression. I mean, the whole starting point for me anyway was everyone talked about this dictatorship. Everyone talked about the military and what had occurred in 1988. But when you arrive in Rangoon, what struck me was just how ordinary everything seemed. The people going about their business, their daily lives. Everything seemed to be. It seemed like a different world. I.e., it's slightly caught in a different sort of time warp. It was amazing for that reason. But I was looking for signs, or cracks with this veneer, and I didn't really see them. I think I was full of ideas that somehow you'd arrive in Rangoon and there'd be coils of razor wire, and there'd be soldiers on every street corner. When I first went to Vietnam in 1988, I remember secret police would follow us. I was expecting that kind of thing. It never happened, at least not to my knowledge. So I was struck by the normality, and you realized as time went on and the more trips I made, extended trips, I realized that, this normality, there was an edge to it. And rather like when you shut off a light in a room, suddenly but your eyes become accustomed to what's going on. You start to see things, you start to understand. There was no need for the military to be on the streets. There was a great quote from some Eastern European dissident about, the censor is no longer at his desk, he's in my head. It's a similar idea, which is that it was a mixture of both collusion and coercion. people knew there were spies everywhere. I wouldn't be aware of that, but there were, as we know, and they still are, I'm sure, informers and so on. And so things were tightly controlled, but you just didn't see it. It wasn't in an obvious way, in a way that you had this idea that things would look in a certain way and they didn't. And so, it's always, that's the great thing about journalism and photojournalism, if your eyes are open, is that you can be surprised constantly. And I was surprised by just how, it's very beguiling as a country. It was very seductive, lovely people, very open, very friendly. But as soon as you start talking about politics, then you'd know. The conversation was shut down immediately.
It's very interesting. I lived there from 2007, so a good number of years before the transition took place and the bad old days, which have sadly returned. And what I would find living there is that you can't really ask a local the nature of the culture you have to navigate, for one, because it's not safe, but for two, it's the old adage of asking a fish to describe water. It's for many that haven't had experience with the outside world, it's all they know, so they don't really know how to describe how it's different. But as a foreigner and who was living there an extended period, and in the very, very, very small community at that time of other foreigners who were living there, you would go through something of an initiation process over a course of months, where slowly, because at first it's like, well, I know all this stuff is happening, but I don't know how to act in it and where to look and what signs things are taking. I could just imagine things, but that has no relation to what's actually happening. But then over a period of like 6 months or so, you do start to get subtle clues and signs that we'd call like the Burma radar, that just a sense, just a type of question, and the sense would be a question that was asked, or a look that was given, or someone that was just out of place. You have to be somewhere long enough to know what's in place to be able to see what's out of place. And that would just be enough to just have this heightened sense of radar to know you just had to do things a little bit differently. Not that it would really matter. I had a friend, famously Christina Peterson, who was deported for no reason whatsoever. They just stopped her bus. To this day, she doesn't know why she was deported. So nothing could really keep you safe. But but at least you would not do things to put yourself in a greater risk and those around you. And then, of course, living in that environment for as long as we did, when you would then take a short trip in Bangkok, it was just kind of mind-boggling. Just like I can have a conversation and open about anything. I can throw things in the trash, whatever it is. I can I can go here and there, and it was just that I still remember that sense of freedom was not so much exhilarating, more kind of baffling and confusing to navigate. And I'm saying all of this from a place of privilege. I'm saying all of this from knowing very well that my lack of freedom was not anything that ever really put me in serious risk other than deportation. One can only imagine when the risks were much higher for those truly resisting.
Yeah, that's the thing that we used to always remind ourselves of, is that the risks. This is the funny thing, actually. During that time when Burma appeared to be one of its many openings up, is that the press descended on Rangoon, and there were all these stories about journalists getting chased by the military intelligence and all the rest of it, as though they were somehow central to the story, which I thought was laughable in the extreme. Because, like you say, the worst thing that would happen to you is you'd be bundled onto a plane, and that would be it. But for Burmese, of course, it's a far more serious, prospect of certainly, interrogation, possibly torture, and possibly a long, jail sentence, even hard labor. You just don't know. But yeah, very different reality.
So I'd like to get into your 2013 book, Brave New Burma, that was the culmination of many of your trips. Before we get into that, I would just like to invite you, if there's any work or trips or experiences that happened before that point, so we go in chronology, that you might like to share.
Well, just to bring it from the previous topic, was that in 1995 I was commissioned by The Guardian to go and photograph. I don't know. I think photograph the dictatorship, I guess. And as I said, that was a difficult thing to do because the visual cues were virtually invisible. You really had to push yourself, or not push yourself, push the boundaries, and you had to. So that's when I arrived in Rangoon, I was looking for visual cues. I was looking for signs, things that I could photograph that would translate. And that was the really challenging thing, is because as I say in my book, you could have a paranoid conversation on a Rangoon street corner. But how do you photograph that? Of course you can't. So how to translate? So that was the big challenge for me as a photographer. Is, well, how do you translate what's going on to ordinary people in Burma and transmit that to the West, which is what my intention was. And of course, with a tight deadline with the Guardian newspaper, even though it was for the magazine, although it was, we had space. I mean, and I only had a couple of weeks in which to fill those pages. Luckily, I did come across some stuff that somehow spoke of what was going on. There was child labour, which remains very common throughout the country. There was prison labour at Mandalay. They were building a road. Prisoners from Mandalay prison were building a road around the periphery. I think by that stage, the military hadn't cottoned on that images of forced labour, sometimes maybe even political prisoners being used as forced labour or prison labour, was not good. A good thing to see. So I remember I spent maybe a good hour with a group of prisoners under armed guard, soldiers with guns, photographing them as they built this road around Mandalay Moat, between the walls and the moat. So yeah, I mean, I managed to get some pictures, but I realized that this was kind of beyond traditional journalism, and that frustrated me because the limitations of the media, which still remain, but I think it's obviously changing hugely nowadays. But back then, it seemed to me that the military were managing to control the narrative very, very effectively. So they would give this appearance of being open, that they were changing, and they would give you, there was a thin corridor of the country in which you were permitted to move at will. Outside of that, it was strictly no-go zones. So they could keep pretty much most of it, out of sight. And of course, with journalists coming in, they've only got tight deadlines and so forth. It seemed to me there was a danger that the military were going to get away with it. And it seemed to me also that there was a failure, there was a problem with our own media in that we can only cover something if it's dramatic or if it's newsworthy, whatever that means. I set out basically to put a face to the dictatorship, to show what does oppression mean? What does it actually look like? How does that translate into images? Of course, it's a big challenge for a photographer to take on something like that. And I knew it was going to take time. I didn't realize it was going to take 20 years, but it did, for a number of reasons. But so that's really where it began. Its genesis was, what does a modern dictatorship look like? And how does it impact the ordinary people? So that's what I decided. I've never, so the way I did it was I would spend my own money going to Burma, and then I would often get Irrawaddy would pay for my expenses, and they would share the images with them. So it was a kind of beneficial mutual relationship. So I would go and spend months on end traveling in different parts of the country over the next, I don't know, from 1990, so going from 92, so I've got images from the book from 92 all the way through to 2012, I think. So yeah, 20-year period.
Wow. That's great. And it really builds up the book, which is going to be, I think, the focal point of this conversation, because the book itself is the culmination of your learning and experiences in Burma. And before we talk about the book in more specifics, before we started recording, you made the comment that the book came out at the worst possible time. And I think that's relevant because it touches upon both what you were trying to impart in the book, as well as the massive changes that very few people saw coming of really the turmoil that's happened in the last 10 years. So describe if you can, what your book was trying to express. I know there's a lot of themes and a lot of content in there, but the real vision of what you were trying to get across, and where that surprising timing fit into that release.
Well, it was, like I say, I was trying to create a visual portrait with supporting text to explain what the images couldn't, what a modern dictatorship looked like in all its complexity and all its contradictions, and also to get away from this what used to be. I think maybe this has an enduring power or enduring theme of good versus evil. This terrible narrative that gets placed. You see it ad nauseam now. You see it in Ukraine. You see it in elsewhere. In different places where it's ultimate evil against ultimate good, and that was not an unfair reading in a sense as a starting point to try and understand Burma with, you've got the people who are aspiring for a democratic system and are moving away from military rule versus an entrenched military. So, David and Goliath, so on and so forth, all the kind of cliches. That was what I was trying to, to explore that and to actually point out that, yes, that's a good starting point. However, no, it's much more complicated and much more compelling than that. And we shouldn't shy away from that complexity. So I was just trying to, as far as I possibly could, tell a story. But also, I thought it was also a chronology, or a chronicle rather, of a period in Burma's history that had been going on for many years before that, and may continue to go on in many years into the future, with this program of reform that was kickstarted in 2011, I think it was, just before the book came out. I thought there was a real danger that we were going to completely forget about the past, that this brave new Burma was going to be ushered in. And really it's about, to some extent, it's about journalism and about how we in journalism tend to, tell stories that we want to hear, to project. And my feeling was, this book is not for Burmese, this book is for Europeans and North Americans, essentially. And there seemed to be such an interest in Burma because it seemed to such a compelling good versus evil narrative, which I thought was really, obviously simplistic. But it suited particularly American foreign policy at the time, with so many disastrous escapades in places like Afghanistan, to side with Aung San Suu Kyi. Every politician who came to Rangoon had to have their photograph with Aung San Suu Kyi, I found the whole thing really nauseating. It was a sort of, so it was very useful without actually taking into consideration, what was really happening and what ordinary Burmese folk were going through. So it was both a chronology of a particular moment in time, and to show that these abuses were continuing, and a warning that they could continue on to the future. And of course, coming out at a time when everyone wanted Burma to live happily ever after, like there's some absurd fairy tale outcome. Nobody was really prepared in the West for the complexity that then followed. And I'll admit, I wasn't either. I really thought there was there was a genuine hope. There was a real sense that things were shifting and moving in a direction that wasn't, a downward trajectory in the way that it had been for so many decades. Suddenly there was hope. But equally, I thought if you know anything about Burma, you'd be very cautious about that hope. However, I think even the most pessimistic of people who have been following Burma for many years would have, admitted that, didn't expect it to get as bad as it did, and has done since. So first you have the Rohingya genocide in Rakhine State, and then you have the military coup a few years ago, and then this incredible spreading of the civil war and it's a complete basket case of a country, really, in many respects. And I don't say that with any glee. But anyway, so that book came out at a time when nobody wanted to know about the horrors of Burma. They wanted it all to be happily ever after. And I mean this in the West. So that it was a sort of an antidote to that. But of course, what happened was that the book sank without trace.
Right. Well, that's the book that we're going to focus on today, and its continued relevance, because as we see with history, and certainly with recent Burmese history, there are these cycles and these rhythms that it keeps following. And so, what you found in your writing and photography during those years that culminated in the book, that seemed to have been swept away to the bad old days in just a matter of months or years, last decade, now has returned to be the clue for unlocking what's actually going on and getting past these simplistic definitions. And I think the best way to get into it may be to go chapter by chapter, because your chapters they focus on completely different prisms and perspectives of what you're trying to capture. And so with that, chapter 1 is your introduction. We've already gone over your background in Burma, as well as your criticism of the simplistic reductionist views on it. So we could go to chapter 2. That's called Scorched Earth. And this is looking at Burma civil wars, the plight of ethnic minorities, Burmanization policies, and marginalized communities. So tell us what stands out from this chapter and what you wanted to impart to readers.
I guess, if I was talking about getting away from the simplistic binary, good versus evil narrative, then obviously the Scorched Earth chapter is a classic, throws a spanner in that sort of concept. So basically, Scorched Earth was to show just how varied and complicated it was. Yes, there's a civil war. Yes, the military are, the main instigators in many respects. But also there are many other kind of fault lines within Burmese society between ethnic groups. I mean, it's often described as one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world, with 135 distinct races, all their different languages and dialects and so on and so forth. But even within those fault lines, there are other fault lines, so it's a very complex picture. And I think, yes, you can say the military at that time certainly were the problem, but there were many other problems as well. And throwing into that mix would be, of course, ethnic divisions, but there's also the drug trade. There's also competing interests of various ethnic groups in different parts of the country. So it was really to look at that and to explore it, but also, and I think crucially, to look at this concept of Burmanization, of this idea that to be truly Burman is to be Burmese, is to be Burman, and to be Buddhist. So this ethnically, I suppose, religious identity is in many ways, one of the biggest problems I think that faces Burma. Because so this kind of chauvinism that Burmans often have is actually a chauvinism that's shared amongst other ethnic groups too. So Shan might consider themselves better than the Palang will consider themselves better than the Wa, and so on and so forth. But this idea of the Burman being the majority, so therefore everyone has to sort of, and the glass ceilings that exist for people, for example, in the military, only certain people can become officers. If you're a Muslim, for instance, you can only get to the rank of lieutenant or whatever it is. So to look at all of those different things and different dimensions to the crisis, that was the purpose of that chapter.
What's interesting about what you say with the different chauvinism that the different ethnicities have is you're right. I mean, the Bamar have been dominant, so theirs has the weight of the dominance that they've portrayed. But if you just look at some of the Buddhist ethnicities, all of them have their mythical origin stories of something that is connecting them to Buddha or Ananda or the Sakyan clan or something that's kind of showing the true Buddhism that rests with them, the true prophecy that rests there, or some grandiose imagined past that was lost, that was taken away by the Bamars. I mean, with the Mun or the Rakhine, it's immediate what that is. The Mun having with the Noyata having conquered them, and I mean the way the Bamar tell it is they borrowed and were inspired by the teachers. The Mun would have a different version of being ransacked and serving their new Bamar kings. And with Rakhine, I mean, where else do you have to look than Mahamuni? And but then with the non-Buddhist populations, I mean, even many of the Christian communities will speak of their background of their prophecy that one day someone would come with the true teachings. And when that came in the form of a Christian missionary, and the Christian missionary was white and Western and had a different religion that they could bring to them that contrasted, that was a world religion coming from the West that can contrast with Buddhism and, take on that identity, they did that. And so you're right that each of those different communities, whatever their standing might be as they go through history, or whatever kind of imagined past they had at one time that was taken away that they're trying to get back to, they all do have this vision of the kind of specialness, unique quality that their mythology gives them, and they're trying to continue on today. So I suppose that in this chapter, this was going into some of these different visions was part of your work.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely this idea that let's look at this complex place immediately, rather than we'll gradually build up to that. Number one. Number two is also literally that was where I started on the border, and I couldn't. I remember looking across into Burma, and trying to sort of didn't get a sense of the country at all. I didn't know anything about it, and all I could see were these villages on the border and these refugee camps. So I was trying to sort of understand that, because I also didn't really see how it connected with the generation of '88 and their struggle and so forth. But of course, it is. You have to. The source of many of it was the military on one level, but it's also deep rooted. I mean, in the case of the Burmans, you talk about. How they all have their kind of their crisis in their history, which kind of all their woes seem to stem from. In the case of the Burmans, it would be the when the British took Mandalay in 1885, and sent Tibor off to India. But I mean, that's also part of the problem, is that Burma's been so closed off, and that's kind of what I was alluding to, looking into something that's sort of cut off, is that's where a lot of these ideas and these notions about themselves have gestated, and a bit like a sort of a hothouse where it's got so contorted they have no other way of really imagining their relationships really, except through these. And of course, that's been assiduously promoted and to great effect by the military and by Ne Win, who brought in this idea of the family of races and so forth. So it's very. I mean, there's a strong sort of fascistic, element to a lot of this. We're looking at who is truly this or truly that, who is more, Rakhine than than whatever, so on and so forth. There's a sort of spiraling out of So the idea was to immediately bring the reader straight into this world is complicated. So, put aside all of your. I mean, and also it's tracing my own experiences. I mean, as I said, I came from a position of great ignorance, and whilst I was traveling, I would be reading constantly and educating myself. And you kind of walk away from it a lot of the time thinking I know nothing.
I don't think I've ever felt that more than reading Martin Smith's book.
Well, that's sort of I think Martin's book is to warn you off the subject, really. It's a great book.
Right. It is, but I don't think I've ever, not just about Burma, I don't think I've ever read a book about anything where I've seriously known so much less after finishing the book and paying as close attention as I could. So, but then, and that actually reminds me, I was hearing, the other day I had a conversation, we were talking about, I can't remember who it was I was speaking to, but it was looking at how some of the ASEAN countries today are orienting themselves towards what's happening in Burma, and the complexity of the different armed groups, and they're asking different diplomats and people in background in international relations to come in and start helping out, making decisions, having conversations. And this person reported to me that one diplomat was saying, like, we need like a 6-month crash course just to understand the acronyms. Like, you're asking us to come to wade into a situation where we're still like, wait, what are these 3 letters and these 4 letters? But this is 1 letter off, but these split and these combined. And so, yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think for me, I think complexity is, it should be interesting. It shouldn't be putting people off the subject. In fact, it should draw you in, because the one thing you don't want is to be told the same story over and over again, which is what I was alluding to earlier about projecting narratives as we do. So I mean, again, I think it can be really fascinating. It doesn't have to be bewildering, and it can be very rewarding and engaging. But I think it's also very vital, if you want to get any measure of understanding what's going on in Burma, you need to understand some of the basics of the problems with regard to ethnic nationalities inside Burma, and the way that's been used by the regime to dominate.
So let's move to your next chapter. This is chapter 3, The Invisible Dictatorship. We did talk about this a little bit before, but can go into more detail here. And this is where you talk about being struck by the contrast between the bustling streets that are filled with cheerful people while there was a dictatorship, and conclude that Burma is a mature totalitarian state, the repression being too subtle for the casual observer. And you have a line here, in fact, the absence of the army was proof of its power. I quite like that one. However, it can be unleashed at any time, and that is certainly the truth, as can the silent resistance to the military can also be unleashed at any time. You see in 2007, all of those videos that came back, you just see these lines of houses and apartments where everyone is waving and yelling and supporting. These are people that are silent for years before that. So both of these are kind of sleeping volcanoes. But what more do you want to say about the invisible dictatorship?
Well, I think I remember being berated by a tour operator, I think she was German, in Pagan, because I think I may have let slip that I was working for The Guardian at the time. This was back in '95. And she ranted and raved about the kind of the negative portrayal of Burma's crisis, as though this was all completely made up by people like Amnesty and whoever else, Human Rights Watch. I mean, of course, I didn't really, and there's no point in arguing with people like this, so I didn't really bother. I just listened to it. But it was interesting. I just thought, wow, I mean, you can come to this country, have a fantastic time, and walk away thinking everything is wonderful. At that time, obviously not now, but back then you could. And I thought, again, it just shows you just how tightly controlled this place is. And it, like you say, it's very insidious, the kind of control that it had. And I thought there was also a danger that maybe journalism would start to cave to that view that, oh, well, it's not as bad as everyone's making out. And of course, if 95 or 90% of the country is basically off limits to you, yeah, of course it's going to look wonderful. I mean, it doesn't take a rock, So I thought, firstly, within that slim corridor of where you were allowed to go, what could you see? What could be seen? And there were things, but you need to talk to people a lot. As a photographer, I can work alone, so I didn't put too many people. At least I hope I didn't put them at risk. And I'd ask people what's happening in various places, and you get a sense of it. I knew some journalists who were being very careful, but we would meet in places that would, that they felt they could talk as freely as possible. So I got quite a lot of help from Burmese colleagues, and directions in which to go. So yeah, an invisible dictatorship. I mean, looking for visual cues of oppression, whatever that meant. I mean, there was the signage, the signposts, which is throughout the book itself to mark each chapter break. So the People's Desire. I don't know if you remember that, but basically, billboards telling us how wonderful the regime was and how they were going to crush all dissent and so on. But apart from that, which is static and not very interesting as a photographer, I mean, I think also there was a frustration for me as a photographer because it was very difficult to get a degree of intimacy. So you couldn't really tell, you couldn't say spend a few days with one person to document their life or whatever, because you'd obviously put them in danger. So to some extent, everything had to be a little bit anonymous at the same time, which is difficult. So very often I'd collect stories inside Thailand from Burmese and change names and so on, and then I'd be able to do that.
Right. One story that comes to mind when you talk about these hidden realities and the reality that is in front of you, we did a remarkable story on our podcast a few years back about an American who became a monk, and wanting to embrace the forest lifestyle as a monk, he took upon walking through the forest and simply sleeping where he was, getting whatever food he could. He ended up walking into an area that was where they had opium, and it was an armed group, and they took him hostage, and they thought that he was CIA. And even as he was trying, I think there was one 14-year-old boy who spoke Burmese, like a little bit Burmese, and he didn't speak any Burmese. He was with another Burmese monk who could talk to him, and none of the others even spoke Burmese. And they had, he describes in harrowing detail how they were alerted to their presence, and they came with makeshift weapons, spears and things, knives, surrounded them, and they were trying to prove to them they were really monks, showing them, their books, their practice. But I don't know to what degree this ethnic group was Buddhist as well. They had their own form of Buddhism, and it was really on a knife's edge whether they would be killed on the spot or allowed to go, because it was basically this existential decision of do we release them and possibly, and if we're wrong, then our whole clan can be wiped out because they'll gain knowledge, or do we kill them and then have the karma of having killed 2 monks, not just people, but 2 monks. The reason I'm telling this whole story is that when you get to this point, he then told me where he was located, and it was something like just a couple miles off the Inle Kala Trek. The Inle Kala Trek that every backpacker takes, is one of the main, we talk about the 95% of the country that's off limits. This is the 5% that's on. This is the 5%. And even in some of those trekking, there was the story a few years ago about people that were trekking in, foreigners that were trekking in Siba and stepped on a landmine. I'm not sure if they were off path or on, but this is where you're not just talking about areas that are open and safe, and then somewhere deep in the jungle, far away in the mountains, there's something else going on. We're talking about a landmine just off the main path, or a kidnapping, possible execution just off the main trekking path. So yeah, these things are right up next to each other.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that, because I remember going up to Sipo, and I went out I made friends with the local National League for Democracy, supporters. And, I asked them about forced labor. And, I think it's in the book somewhere, but basically it wasn't a question of, was there any? It was sort of like which village, whose turn was it that week, that kind of thing. So I remember we went out on a motorbike, and after I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, we came to land owned by military, and it was all maize. And I went across to talk to the soldier. I mean, I think he was in mufti, so he was just wearing normal Burmese clothes, but he was a soldier on military land, and there were workers working. And they showed me they held up a sack for the maize, and it was CP, which is a big Thai conglomerate. So CP was obviously buying directly from the military to package their maize that they had taken the land. Not only had they taken the land, but they were forcing the villagers to harvest it and to grow it. I mean, it was really interesting. But further down the road, in the same trip, I remember I came across another, I went to photograph more forced labour of an entire village, but we got stopped by the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military, because just down the road, the Shan State Army South had just crossed, or there'd been a small battle. So yes, you're right, absolutely. It's right on the edge. You didn't have to go very far, but of course you can go very far. Well, you can't. How far is too far? I mean, so if you get caught up in something like that, I mean, that's just, very bad luck indeed. But yeah, it just shows you how unstable it really was. And a good example for this chapter would be to look at the massacre at Depayin. So, when Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy and her followers were attacked in a place called Depayin. I couldn't get to Depayin because it was too difficult, and I didn't. It's quite far away from the kind of corridor of access, if you like, that foreigners were allowed to. So I remember I interviewed a monk here in Thailand who had been at Depayin, and I managed to get a photograph of the scene shortly after the massacre had occurred, and photograph the photograph, and then interview this monk to get the details of what he saw. So there were ways around it, but it was not, for a photographer, it was difficult. And it was also about educating yourself about how you can make sense of things visually. So there was one example was a photograph of these guys at a tea shop, which is ubiquitous, as you know, throughout Burma. And on the other side of the road, in Pa'an, in Karen State, on the other side of the road were these big billboards about, the Tatmadaw crushing all enemies or whatever. And the photograph worked in such ways that it had this conspiratorial feel, that they were sitting around talking about something they shouldn't be. And then in the background, you've got this billboard. So this sort of the omnipotent kind of big brother kind of feel of Burma. But on top of that, if you know something of Burma's crisis, you'll know that 1988 began from a discussion that occurred in a tea shop. And so suddenly it takes on this whole different meaning. So that's how you get around it. And very often it would be, that's why words are so important in the book, is to try and explain what isn't apparent. And then suddenly it becomes sort of pregnant with meaning.
That's brilliant. You've referenced that sign about the descent, those 4 points, several times. And it's reminding me about in downtown Yangon on Sule Pagoda Road, there was a very prominent sign in Burmese and English right on as you entered the bridge. And as the transition started, that sign started to fall in disrepair. And then as it was replaced, guess what the next sign was during the transition? Coca-Cola.
What a great metaphor.
Yeah, I mean, could you make it up? And it was, I still remember the day I saw it, I froze in my tracks, because after living in Burma that long, where Coke was this privileged beverage, it was hard to find. It was like one of 3 countries in the world where there was no Coke bottling plant. I actually have a friend whose family was some of the main smugglers of Coca-Cola into the country. That was how they made their fortune, was by smuggling Coca-Cola. And I think the day the sanctions were lifted, they had a bottling plant the very next day, and that was the ad they put up. And then I further learned that they were very confused how they went about advertising their product, because they had never entered such a new market before like this in generations. And they had very little market research or contacts on the ground. And so it was very minimalist. It was a Coca-Cola bottle that just said "drink Coke." And I learned that was the first original advertisement Coca-Cola ever did. So they just went back to their history to put that up on the sign in downtown Yangon, Sule Pagoda Road, replacing the prominent 4 points of crushing dissent.
It's quite good, isn't it? Drink Coke or else, Yeah. No, it's yeah. So it was looking for those sort of cues, I guess. But I mean, there are other ways more. I mean, my strength generally, I think, photographically has been portraiture, which I've actually spent a great deal of time not a great deal of time thinking about. Very often with photography, I was looking for narratives. I was thinking of what speaks of what, you know, and that's a kind of fairly reductive way of approaching photography because it is its own language. It is a different way of communicating. A good example would be my portrait of Aung San Suu Kyi in the book, which, you know, became somewhat kind of iconic, I suppose, you know, sort of brandished by protesters throughout the world. But the reason it was different is because A, it was in black and white, but also because it showed a different side to Suu Kyi. At the time, when Aung San Suu Kyi was first released from house arrest, you know, she was one of the few politicians I actually wanted to photograph. You know, I thought here was a woman who had, you know, said things that I could understand and relate to. They made sense to me. And I think at a time when the world was looking, you know, looking grim as it rather is now, she seemed to be one of the few voices that you know, people could look up to. And she meant a great deal, of course, to the Burmese. But all the photographs taken by the international media at the time showed, you know, they were usually color photographs. That was one thing. But also they would show Aung San Suu Kyi, who'd just spent 5 or 6 years under house arrest, completely cut off from the outside world, as being this kind of glamorous woman that they're always laughing off the years of isolation and deprivation. And I thought, well, that's not really a true reading of her and her situation, because I think, obviously, ultimately, journalism should be, whether it's photography or the written word, should be about the truth. Aung San Suu Kyi was many things. I mean, she was certainly, you know, very charismatic. She had, I mean, watching her in front of her gate when she was permitted to talk to her followers at the weekends was yeah, it was amazing. It was an amazing experience to be there. And she had a clear rapport with the crowd, and they adored her and so on. And, you know, all that hope wrapped up in this one singular figure. But it came at a great cost to both her and to her family that she was in this position. And I thought there's much more to this woman than simply, you know, she's a great icon. I mean, she's clearly made of fairly, you know, steely stuff. How to reflect that? And that was, you know, I spent a lot of time thinking about, once I get my opportunity to photograph her, how am I going to do it? And I remember I sketched out various ideas and sketchbooks because I knew that when the time came, I wouldn't have much time to do it. But yeah, I mean, so people didn't like it at first because they thought it was, you know, Burmese particularly didn't like it because they thought it was too kind of stern and all the rest of it. But I wanted to show something, you know, an ambiguous image and also images that are, because photography is ambiguous by nature, you know, you can't avoid that. But I went, you know, I wanted to reflect something of her strength, but also strengths can also be the weaknesses, or perhaps not the weaknesses, but both strengths can be both a positive and a negative thing. And in this case, I still think the photograph holds up over time, despite what happened later with the Rohingya crisis and Aung San Suu Kyi and her fall from grace. But also, she's another classic example of projection. You know, we projected so much on her. Yes, she knew that, and she used it to her great advantage, you know, as a good politician should. And I don't think everyone thought that she would fall so dramatically. But we also put her up onto this ridiculous pedestal, as though that she was infallible, that she was, you know, somehow she's all sugar and spice and all things nice. When actually she's a tough woman. I mean, you don't go through what she went through. And you'd be soft and gooey on the inside. I mean, that's just, you know, she's not who she is at all.
Yeah. You say you wanted to capture these different qualities than we're usually seeing in a photograph. I'm not from a field of photography. I'm from a field of writing. I certainly understand how through the words that I craft, I can come at things from different sides, from different angles, but I'm the one who has the agency as the writer to, certainly I can't fabricate facts, but I can take the facts that are interesting, put them together. With photography, you're capturing a subject that you can't impose anything onto. She's certainly not a model. You can say, now look like this, or now give me this emotion. So can you talk about the technical qualities of photography that allows you to capture these things, even though you don't really have any role in creating them?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's an awful lot of, when it comes to photography, I mean, I do struggle with it, and I don't find it doesn't come naturally to me. I mean, it isn't easy. I mean, I think you do impose your narrative on it. My narrative just happened to be a different one, and I have to say that I think early on, I think some of us had our reservations about Aung San Suu Kyi, but she was still somebody to admire, and more importantly, she was somebody in which people placed a great deal of hope. and nobody, you can't scoff at that at all. I mean, that's important. People need it, of course. But I think what I was trying to allude to was the fact that she was both, I think, slightly aloof, which is not a good thing necessarily, but definitely steadfast, strong, resilient. All of these various, descriptive words can be attributed to her, but there are also less flattering ones, such as, she could be very stubborn, very arrogant, intolerant. I mean, I heard her say things that I thought really took me aback. I remember her very clearly scoffing at the students who had joined the insurgency at the time, saying, well, they should stop playing soldiers in the jungle and go and get themselves a proper skill so that they can help in the reconstruction of Burma when the time comes. And I thought, well, there's somebody who really doesn't know anything about what's happened in Burma. I mean, you may be the daughter of the country's sort of founding father and historic hero, but you don't understand anything about what's going on in the periphery in the insurgency, the areas of insurgency, and also what people have actually suffered, what they've actually physically endured. I mean, I'm sure you've come across plenty of cases where people talk about being gunned down or their friends being gunned down right in front of them in the streets. So, you don't go and join an insurgent army and risk everything because it's fun. So it showed me also something about who she was. She had lived this very privileged, isolated world. And yet, I mean, much later on, I remember writing a story where I compared and contrasted her with Yord Serk, who's one of the leaders of one of the Shan ethnic groups, and his experience growing up in Burma versus her experience growing up in privilege in Delhi and later in the UK. So there was So, I mean, I always looking at this sort of ambivalence of photography and trying to find a way. One of the reasons that it's all in black and white is because I was trying to capture a mood to give a sense that, because it was easy. When you go to Burma, you see the Shwedagon, it's glimmering, it's beautiful, it's golden, people are beguiling and friendly and laughing a lot, and so on and so forth. I was trying to get right away from all of that and try and sort of give people a sense of, I suppose, inverted commas, the reality. But again, projecting, but to some extent trying to reflect something of a mood rather than just simply saying, oh, how beautiful or whatever. So that was one reason. The other thing was, again, like I said, to try and take photographs where there was a narrative, where you could see clearly what was going on in it. It could be, forced labor, it could be soldiers, it could be whatever it was. Something that immediately spoke of what we would expect it to speak of, if you follow me. So, dictatorship, what is it? Oh, it's soldiers, whatever. But then my focus became much later. As I was going along, I would photograph people that I just thought were striking. And I realized that actually that was the thing that really, really was the thing that you realize early on when you first arrive in Rangoon is the look. People are it's such a diverse country, and there's so many different looks that you can, come across these people with all their different ethnic backgrounds and so forth. So I would just photograph people that I thought were striking, and I thought that's one way I can speak of its diversity, speak of the people, and not put them, of course, in any kind of danger without trying to sort of have a narrative, inverted commas, but actually just talk about people. So the book itself begins with just the portraits of these very striking, in some cases, kind of, very ambiguous or ambivalent kind of looks. Some of them very androgynous, which I don't know, for some reason I'm drawn to. So I wanted to, again, it's getting to the sort of more complicated, but no less engaging. I think, hopefully people would be drawn in by it. So that's what I was trying to do. I don't know, again, people can just judge themselves whether I succeeded or not.
Well, let's get to the next chapter. This is a completely different prison. This is chapter 4, Burma's Gulag. And this is where you're looking at political prisoners, the conditions of prison, the intelligence apparatuses, and human rights violations that go on there. This is sadly a very relevant perspective to look at today. When the coup first broke, I think the thing that made me break down and actually break into tears was just the realization that this younger generation that in 2021 that had not known these things other than memories told to them by elders they didn't quite understand or even believe at times, that they were now going to have their bones broken by this reality, and just the unfairness of seeing this cycle repeat yet again. And so sadly, this deep dive you did generations, decades ago, into the prison conditions is could not be more relevant today. So what would you like to share about what you learned from your time?
Well, initially it was sort of very easy to photograph prisoners because, so I need to explain, I think there are many different aspects to it, and I tried to sort of understand what was going on. So there's this thing called traditional labour, which you've come across, I'm sure, which is essentially forced labour, where you force entire villages to carry out a, I don't know, it could be irrigation of a canal, it could be any amount of, labour forced by the military, so they have to do it, or else it's, taken to prison or whatever. And then there was child labour, which was again very ubiquitous. You'd see kids working on roads throughout the country. And then there was the prison labour, which again, I spent a lot of time with these Burmese students here in Bangkok, and many of them had ended up being interrogated and very often tortured in prison in Burma. So obviously I knew something of their experiences. But I needed to show it in some way, to photograph it. And that was difficult. At first, it was easy. I had that time in Mandalay, but then the military began. They understood that the pictures were being used to explain, how the harsh realities of life under Burma's military. But I wanted to try and sort of again comprehensively photograph it in pictures. So I was always looking for child labour, forced labour, and prison labour. And prison labour is quite easy because they wear a white uniform, and very often they're wearing shackles around their ankles. And the point about prison labour is that, in a country like Burma, in a military dictatorship, there's no distinction between a common criminal and a dissident. They're treated the same. And the point being is that if you photograph these prisoners, some of them may well indeed be political prisoners. They may have been colleagues of your friends in exile or whatever. So I spent a lot of time going to different places, asking people where prisoners were. I mean, they were in Myitkyina, they were in in Shan State and in central Burma and all over the place. The difficulty was getting close enough to them to be able to take the photographs. So one of the photographs I did take, my wife came to join me in Nongshui in Shan State, as I knew that there was a quarry nearby where prisoners were working with, they had chains on their ankles. They were also working on agricultural land near the prison there. There's a big prison. So my wife helped me get a photograph. We pretended we were sort of clueless tourists, and walked right into this quarry where these guys were working with their chains. And I walked down into it and started taking photographs immediately. And then immediately we got shouted at. So some guard with a gun came up, and Joy, my wife, was pretending, offering him peanuts. So I don't know what, but, and we realized that obviously we knew that they wanted to get rid of us, but not before I got my photographs. And we said, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I had no idea." We thought, this kind of thing. Nothing ever happened. I got the pictures. They appeared in the book, but it was very difficult. I mean, I spent ages doing that, in different parts of the country, trying to get close to prisoners, trying to get close to prisons, Mandalay prison, prisons in Chengtung or wherever it is. Eventually, I did a lot of the interviews of former political prisoners and people who'd suffered, torture inside Thailand as well. And one set of photographs I set up. For the simple reason is I just wanted to show what we wouldn't be able to see with the full collusion of somebody who had experienced it. So it's a kind of visual testimony, if you like, where former political prisoners showed me the regulation prison positions they were forced to endure. So some of them were stress positions, meaning torture. Others were just what you had to do when a guard walked past. You had to like hang your head or whatever it was. So that was a way of kind of circumnavigating the restrictions of trying to photograph as an outsider. One of the reasons that I worked for Irrawaddy for all of those years is because I had a meaningful role in the sense that as a foreigner, I could take photographs and I could go to places that no Burmese could do that. That was one of the privileges of being an outsider. Obviously that changed much later in 2012, where suddenly all these amazing Burmese journalists and photographers who were more than capable, very capable of doing much better work than I could do. But anyway, I mean, at that time it was very difficult, and that's how I managed to get those pictures. That kind of thing. I mean, I remember one time being on a train from, I think I was going to Mon from Rangoon, and I remember, you could hear the clink. The train stopped, and you could hear the clink, clink, clink of metal on rock. And then it gradually pulled away, and then suddenly there's this huge quarry was revealed, and all these people in white uniforms and chains on their feet and armed guards. And it was a bizarre, it was sort of, and then the train would move on, and it would move out of shot, and that would be it. And you're back to the normality of Burma, and that was kind of it, right? You suddenly you see something that would disrupt the idea that you had of Burma, of a country. Suddenly you have this keyhole into this other gulag existence that a lot of people lived in, and then suddenly it's gone, and almost to the point where you think, did I really see that? Right. And of course you can't take a photo. I mean, taking a camera out, you just get into trouble, or you get your camera nicked, or your film stolen from somebody. So I didn't do that. At the time when that happened, actually I was in a carriage full of Burmese troops, so didn't do anything. But weird. I mean, but that was it. It'd suddenly reveal itself to you, and then it would be gone. And you'd be thinking, I don't know if you remember that film, what's it called? Requiem for a Dream. Mm-hmm. And the guy is a projectionist in the cinema, and he gets bored of these films that he's projecting, just regular films that people come to watch. And he would splice it with hardcore pornography of maybe 3 or 4 frames. It was like that, where you suddenly, did I really see what I just saw? Yeah. And you think, what's going on? The same thing. But of course it was real. Of course you know that, because you'd be looking for it.
That's fascinating. I'm just absorbing that story. I identify with it. I resonate with that. It's the way you describe it is quite profound, and I could sense that it's not just your experience of encountering that, but also your thought process as a journalist of then, how do I, this thing that I don't even know if I just witnessed, although I know I did, but I kind of don't, how do I, and I couldn't, for all kinds of reasons, I couldn't whip out a camera, how do I possibly reveal this to an audience? And I'm also bringing to light the confrontation with the German tour leader that is coming from a background of, oh, no, things are like this and that, and this is not, that kind of archetype of the German tour leader you talked about. This is not one person or something happening in the past. You only have to go on YouTube to see these absolutely silly, ridiculous, in some ways you could say, conspiratorial, like YouTubers that are going to, I went to a war zone or something, and they're 24 hours, 48 hours in Yangon and filming as they go through markets and stuff, and trying to thinking that they have some insight into what's happening. And revealing the normalcy. I mean, a lot of it...
Revealing their ignorance, I think.
Exactly. I can't stand to watch more. I never want to watch these. Somehow my algorithm has got, you click on one and then you just get all the others, and I'll watch just a couple minutes just to see the angle of it. But, or kind of flip around the video, and what you get a sense of is just like, well, everyone's saying that this is going on, but I just walked through the market, or I went to the hotel, or I went to the restaurant, and really it's like, Western media is not, they're doing their normal thing of not reporting on what's actually happening here.
I mean, there is a danger, of course, of going to a place and having a preconceived notion of it and looking for that, right? There's always a danger that but journalism should be about actually changing your mind. So, I mean, that's what I think is attractive, or should be attractive about journalism, is that I'd always have a preconceived idea of something. You go in and go to the place, and you go and talk to the people involved, and you go and see for yourself. And suddenly you realize it's not this, it's something entirely different. I never envisaged that it would be like this. And that's the enriching and exciting part of journalism. It's not about confirming your own prejudices. I mean, I think that's really redundant and, pointless, really. I mean, I think, yeah, and also a great deal of stuff that you see online now it's very narcissistic. It's where they put themselves at the center. Exactly. And I don't get that either. I don't understand why that's important, because, I mean, I think I don't know, it just sort of sits very badly with me, because, when I go to Burma, and very much as an outsider and very much as a visitor, I can walk away. It's absurd. I think it is absurd. Literally, I think it's absurd. I think the whole thing is absurd. The whole thing of going to another place and sort of trying to sort of get to grips with it. There is something slightly absurd about that idea in the first place. But anyway, I think I think as we were talking about earlier, that you have to approach these things with humility, because they are complex and difficult. And the more I learn about Burma, the less I know. Just like that goes for anywhere, really. But yeah. What was I going to say? There was one thing that was one story I wanted to tell you. Was I was up in Machina, and I knew that they were building the airport. The prison labourers, including political prisoners, were being forced by the military to extend the airport. And I went up there, and I spent ages. Well, it seemed like ages. I was trying to befriend the armed guards who were looking after over the prisoners as they toiled in the sun. They were smashing rock. And I went over and over. I think over the course of 3 days, when I kept back, I thought I was getting real progress, and I was getting so frustrated. They were right in front of me, and I just wanted to photograph them, but of course I couldn't, because I was hanging out with the guards, and I was hoping that they might sort of lessen. Say, yeah, you can go and take a few photographs. And of course that didn't happen, and I just got frustrated and started taking photographs anyway. And I walked away, and I think further down the road, suddenly a jeep pulls over and tells me, some guy in the back says, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to town." He says, "Get in, I'll give you a ride." So he gives me a ride, and we start talking, and we exchanged our addresses. He asked me my name, and I said my name is Eric Blair, which is George Orwell's real name, and told him where I was staying. And then he gave me a lift to the market or something like that. And then I realised I had to get out of town fairly quickly. So I did, but I first had to go to the YMCA, which is where I was staying, I think it was, pick up my bag, and then head straight to the train station. And the receptionist said, "Oh, the military have been asking after you," because obviously I was the only foreigner in town, I think, so fairly easy to find. Anyway, I managed to get onto the train and leave Machina with my film intact. And I think it was in Mogok, probably at about 1 o'clock in the morning or something. I was pulled off the train by these. Oh no, not pulled off the train at all. Suddenly, these Tamador, these troops, came up and they said, "Is your name Eric Blair?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Show us your passport." So I showed my passport, and it hadn't got Eric Blair in it, obviously. And they said, "Well, give us some. Were you taking photographs in Machina?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Take photographs of the temples and and all that sort of stuff." And said, "Yeah, but we need you to give us the film." And I said, "Well," and I said this sort of back and forth went on for quite some time, holding up the train. And eventually, I had to hand them over a roll of film, and it was slide film, which I knew that they couldn't process up in China. And they seemed to be happy with that. And then on went my journey. And then the other thing, what was happened on that trip? Oh yeah, my bags, somebody had stolen my passport. So by the time we got to Mandalay, I realised I hadn't got a passport. Wow. So I went to military intelligence headquarters in Mandalay to report that my passport had been stolen. The whole thing was so ridiculous. I mean, eventually I got a passport and everything, that was fine. But it was just all sort of so ridiculous, really. I mean, I was going to military intelligence having taken photographs of things that I wasn't supposed to and given wrong film to soldiers and all this sort of. The other thing I realised, it was quite an incompetent dictatorship too. Yeah. That was the other thing that was sort of marked. It was just not very effective. Yeah. It may have been very effective for Burmese, but as far as dealing with us, it wasn't so. And I think they were slightly hesitant because you're a foreigner, so they're not quite sure how much power they exert over you. And of course their power is total. They had no idea. Yeah. It's all an illusion, as you know. And you're in this incredible bubble of privilege where people, you can get away with lots and people don't touch you. And then you can use that to great advantage, which I fully did. Doing the photography, taking photographs. I mean, I pushed the boundaries as far as I possibly could. But Burmese couldn't do that because they were, for the obvious reasons. So that was, I think that was pretty much the intention behind that, was to show what everyone was talking about and to try and explain it a bit and how it worked.
So moving on to the next chapter, this is chapter 5, The Enemy Within. And this is where you're providing a portrait of the armed forces. And again, you're, with your perspective, wanting to break down this reductionist, simplistic view, a united force that is mindlessly just exerting brutality among the people. That's the kind of lead headline that pulls you in. But then as you go into the surface, you see that there's more there. And there's a quote in here that really struck me. You wrote that quote, "The closer one looks, the distinction between perpetrator and victim, freedom fighter and oppressor becomes more blurred." So I'd like to invite you to unpack that quote.
I think what the starting point for that was that back in 1992, I was taken by the Karen National Liberation Army to go and visit some prisoners they'd captured at a battle called the Battle of Sleeping Dog Mountain. And suddenly you're kind of fronted with these young, in fact, a photograph appeared in the book, these young men who had all allegedly taken part in atrocities. They'd been captured in this battle, and they were all suffering from beriberi and malaria, kept in pretty rank conditions by the Karen. And I think at the time the Karen were trying to get international recognition for their cause because they couldn't look after prisoners. They were trying to get ICRC involved and so on. But yeah, I mean, this is the kind of monolithic Burmese army you've been told about, and they were just very sad, very depressed looking young men who'd obviously traumatized, but obviously been part of things that So it's this whole idea of the idea is that the good is over, or the bad is over there, and good is with us. I mean, that's a sort of a universal kind of delusion, if you like. I mean, the evil that the man perpetrates is inherent in every one of us. But I think what interests me was that it's very easy to empathize with victims of oppression or of conflict or whatever it is. It's less, and we're very ready to do that. And we're seeing this, of course, now with Gaza, but we're not so keen to understand the perpetrator. And frankly, I think the perpetrators, which is understandable, our empathy, we should empathize with victims of torture and of oppression and so forth. However, that's an easy moral position to take. What interests me more is actually, well, who are the military? Who are the people who contribute to the suffering? Who perpetrates this? Are they themselves completely blameless? Why do they do whatever it is that they're doing? How did it get to a position where they can do these things like burn down houses with people in them and so on? So I thought, for me, everyone was talking about this military dictatorship, and I didn't understand, how is it that a country of 40, 50 million people could live under this oppressive regime without some sort of collusion? I mean, there had to be, right? It didn't make sense. So that's what I mean by the perpetrator and the victim becoming difficult to understand. I mean, somebody who, for instance, informs to military intelligence because they know that if they inform, then they can get a favor to get more food or some sort of favor to maybe to help their kid get to Singapore or something like that. Does that make them? I mean, they're certainly not ideologues, but they're pragmatists. But I mean, that's what I mean by this kind of grey zone between victim and perpetrator. But actually, it's paper thin. Yeah. People who contribute. I mean, you have to look at the Israelis. I mean, classic example of the IDF right now is that they're behaving much like the Nazis did in the 1930s and 40s, and that is true. And of course, though, you can't say that. You're not allowed to say that sort of thing. But I think it's important to see that. But I often say that if the price of remembering the Holocaust is Gaza, then I think we're better off forgetting, because like I say, the idea of eternal victimhood, you can justify anything. And that's what often you hear when you're in Burma, is that at least I used to hear a lot, is that, we were treated so badly by the British, divide and rule, and they excluded Burmans from sort of key positions and brought in the Karen and the other ethnic groups to run, and the Indians particularly, to run the administration and so on and so forth. But you can continue with that, but it ends up where we are now with this sort of endless cycle of violence. So I thought it's very important to understand the dynamic of victimhood and oppressor, because they are two sides of the same coin. And the sooner that we sort of recognize that, then perhaps we can work towards something. But I think that's absolutely crucial. And in the case of Burma, it's no less true than it is anywhere else. But it's something, I think it's a truism that we're very reluctant to engage with, because it makes us uncomfortable to look at ourselves and think, well, actually, if I were in that position, I could possibly be in the wrong set of circumstances. Who knows?
The thing that began to strike me the longer I lived in Burma and the more I learned about it, was just how few people seemed to benefit from the system. Just how the system was bad for such a huge number of people. When I first got there, it was more of an impression that, well, the people that have chosen to go towards the dark side or have been or perhaps they don't have other choices and they've gone there for whatever reason in the military and crony majority Bamar, that have gone there. They have some benefit in holding it up. And as you start to look more, you see that in those worlds of crony and military, it really is dog eat dog, and there's tremendous infighting. And even if you tenuously hold on to something for a moment in time, that could be taken away from you with even worse consequences than if you never got to that station. So the amount of power that you have to amass, and amass through pretty nasty means, to be able to really get at those riches, you're talking about a very, 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 very small percentage of people that are actually truly benefiting from this system. Some might benefit more by having some involvement than completely on the outside, but the level of pain they're actually going through, the level of uncertainty and danger, risk and harm, it's tremendous. And that was the real tragic thing when I started to realize, is that here's this system that so few people benefit from. I don't know how true that is of other oppressive systems in the world, that you have that thin of a number of people who are actually benefiting by it continuing, and yet so many people are perpetuating the continuation of that, because you just need a certain kind of sea change or mass wave to make any difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is incredibly complicated, but I think it's you keep people scrabbling around for the the morsels that are tipped from the head table type of thing. It's interesting that a lot of the legislation that the military uses to keep people in their place is actually from the British time, ironically.
Yeah.
So there's also it's very feudal in terms of very rigid hierarchy and structure within Burmese society. That doesn't help. The fact that you unquestionably follow what your elders tell you, good or bad, that's the kind of morality is based on that kind of reading, rather than is this right? But also just basic survival. You know what happens if you don't. You know what happened to so and so. I guess it's that sort of. Yeah. But the other thing is, I was trying to sort of address, I thought, something that the Western world was reluctant to engage with. They didn't want to talk about the military. The military were just beyond the pale of any. And I thought, well, you're going to have to deal with them, because they are huge. Firstly, they're in control of the country. At that time, they were mostly. On top of that, you're going to have to. You can't do what you did in Iraq, which is have a regime overthrow and then disband the army and the Ba'ath Party. Yeah. It's just nonsense. Yeah. You've got to accommodate them, and Burmese have to accommodate them. So if you're going to find a resounding, solution to the problems of Burma, they have to be a central part of that solution. So the idea of posturing in the West, which so many activists really used to get under my wit, because I just thought, firstly, it's not helpful, because it doesn't help. You don't understand much about the military, and I certainly don't understand much about the military, but you need to at least attempt to understand their perspective. They don't think they're bad. They think that what they're doing is for the good of the country, as well as their own self-interest. But you need to engage with that. But I remember being told very clearly within Soros's office, if you mentioned the military, they would be hissed at. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just nonsensical to me. So I was curious about the military, because I thought, I mean, surely part of the problem has to be part of the solution. They are all-encompassing. They are so much in control. They are vital that we understand their dynamic and also their legitimate perspective. Rather like at the moment with Putin, he's like, the new Hitler, which I think is ridiculous. The idea that Putin doesn't have legitimate, security concerns. The same thing with Burma. The Burmese military have their own legitimate concerns, and you need to take them seriously. So you know what I mean? You can't simply go in there and say, well, you're evil, So this book is about addressing it to a Western audience, but particularly people who, the activists who had an interest in perpetuating and promoting this idea of ultimate evil of the military over ultimate good of Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy and the forces of democracy. And I wanted to say, well, you really need to understand the military if you're going to find a lasting solution to the problems. You forget about whether you think they're good or bad. It's kind of irrelevant. So that's what that chapter was really about, was to have a look at the military and try and understand something of their worldview. Understand why would people join the military? And the usual reasons, you know, and you'll hear young men talk about, well, I wanted a smart uniform, or 3 meals a day, or status, power, prestige, all of those usual things which you hear in any group of young men joining any military across the globe.
Let's move to chapter 6. This is Freedom from Fear, obviously taken from Aung San Suu Kyi's favorite expression and the title of her book. In your case, freedom of fear is indicating those Burmese that are outside of the country, either through the case of migrants or refugees, much darker issues of human trafficking, prostitution. And again, this is something that we talk about the cyclical nature of Burmese history and its most tragic aspect, and this is something where to whatever degree you were reporting it back on the day, it is just, you know, the situation of where we're at now and how bad this is, and, you know, same types of things happening in greater quantities. You didn't, back in your day, there weren't scam centers, you know, that's just a whole other pain that's being dealt with. And with I see also that your chapter covered the problems with AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria. I can't read that without thinking about the recent U.S. funding cuts that have just decimated an already fragile situation. So again, your reporting is touching upon something from decades ago, which strangely enough did not seem relevant in 2013, but in 2025 it could not be more relevant or prescient when we're talking about the issue of Burma. So what would you like to flesh out for our audience on this chapter?
Well, I guess the chapter was to talk about Burma's exports. I mean, in the sense of what impact does the military dictatorship, what impact did it have beyond the borders of the country itself? And of course, it had huge, you know, impacts. I mean, you've got this huge migrant workforce, mainly coming to Thailand, but also going to places like China and to a lesser extent India and so on. And then, of course, you've got the refugees in Bangladesh and up and down the Burmese border with Thailand, and also inside the country itself. So it was looking about this massive displacement and what Burma, the crisis, how it impacts the people, but how that in turn impacts the countries around it. And of course, disease is rife, and that's a big part of it. So that was the main, you know, that's what I wanted to look at. What happens to people who manage to get away from this? What is life better for them? And very often it's a different set of horrible challenges and inverted commas choices, from people working in the fishing industry, virtual slaves, to, you know, the unfortunate situation with, you know, young women being trafficked into brothels and so forth. Now, the scam centres is something obviously very new, and is only just being, I think, the alarm bell is being raised a little bit, but it is a big problem. And of course, yeah, but the cutbacks for US aid, I mean, this is the thing I don't understand about these cutbacks. Whatever, you know, inflated bureaucracies there are that exist surrounding, you know, US aid and the politicization of aid in other countries, this is a country where the aspirations of the people align with US foreign policy interests. Why are they doing this? It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, this idea that it's sort of, again, black and white. I mean, there's lots of stuff that's questionable about US aid, no doubt about it, but there's also a lot of stuff that's good. This idea that it's all one thing or another is, I mean, it sort of reflects the sort of mentality of a man-child of like Elon Musk. And also very short-sighted in terms of American soft power. That's the thing I don't understand. I think when you think about how little money is involved, but how much impact it has, that's what I don't get. If they start going after the NSA and the CIA and so on, you know, in their attempt to clear up this massive bureaucracy and also this overspent, then that would be something. But this is, it's less than 0.5% of the GDP. I mean, it's, you know, it doesn't make any sense. And it means something to people here. I mean, I think it certainly means something for the Rohingya, you know, one of the biggest refugee camps in the world in Bangladesh. I mean, I don't know what choices there are for it. It just seems to, that's the awful thing about Burma, is it just seems to be a sort of unrelenting kind of downward spiral. Just when you think it can't get any worse, it suddenly does. But I mean, I think the other thing was also that people were, certainly when I was working on Burma, people were making the best that they could in very difficult circumstances, and I thought that people should look beyond simply the dictatorship, but look at what happens to the countries around it and the people who have to flee, in order just to survive or to make their lives better. And you've got this amazing number of people here in Thailand from Burma working construction, or even the shop just around the corner when I went to get some baklava, where was she from? Kachin State or something. So there, just to address that and have a look at what was happening to ordinary people who'd fled the country to try and get away from all of this.
Mm-hmm. And where exactly did you go in seeking out those communities, and what are stories that stood out from you and conditions that you found?
Well, I went to Bangladesh, of course, to the Rohingya camps. This is before the genocide of 2017. I went to Kachin State along the Chinese border, and then along the Thai-Burma border, which is the most accessible. I think the main story that sort of stuck out for me was one of a woman called Cho Cho Win. It's not her real name, but she'd been trafficked into a brothel, and it was just one of those singularly awful stories. But it was an interesting story in the sense that I had my fixer was Burmese, named Susu, and she helped me get to this shelter for these women who had been, they were all HIV positive. Cho Cho Win was one of them. She was there, and I went to talk to them about spending some time with them because I wanted to get their stories and to tell their stories and photograph their lives as they lived in this border town. And they were supported by a local NGO, and they were just given time to sort of. It was almost like a hospice, but not quite. And they were amazing, really. I said to them, look, this is what I want to do. This is for a book, and this book is looking at this, and I explained as best I could through Susu what I was doing. And they all immediately, I said, how would you feel about me spending some time to photograph you? And they all immediately said, yes, no, that's fine, no problem. And then I said, well, look, rather than answer now, why don't you think about it? And I'll come back in the morning, and then you can say, but you are absolutely, you must be absolutely honest, and if you don't want to do it, that's absolutely fine. So the following day we came back, and they all said no, which was interesting because I think the ethics and dilemmas that you face sometimes as a photographer, you can be willing to take advantage of your privileged position as an outsider. And in this case, Cho Cho Win turned around to me and said, look, you can photograph me, it's fine, because I'm going to die soon anyway. So I did. I spent some time with her, but her story was particularly tragic because she'd come across to seek her fortune, I suppose, being trafficked by a Thai policeman who then took her down to Bangkok but raped her on the way and sent her to, instead of washing dishes in a restaurant, which is what she was led to believe would happen to her, she was taken to a brothel. She managed to escape, get back to the border, but had contracted the virus, and because of the dire situation inside Burma, and at that time I remember antiretroviral drugs were going to be banned from being sent inside the country as part of the sanctions campaign against the military dictatorship led by people like Mitch McConnell in the United States. So she wasn't going to get any antiretroviral drugs, and of course, there's a great deal of with poverty come all sorts of other diseases, and of course, once you've got an opportunistic disease and your immune system is compromised, you don't have long to live, really. And she died, I think about 6 months after I photographed her. But it was just sort of a very typical story. Again, these awful stories repeated again and again and again, and they just don't get really much airtime or much concentration. I mean, that's for me where I think journalism should be, is on the periphery, not the periphery, I consider it the centre, but away from these kind of centres of power and talking to ordinary people whose lives are actually impacted by, the decisions of politicians thousands of miles away. In this case, I think misguided, my view was it was a misguided attempt at sounding tough against the military regime who didn't care, wouldn't be affected by it anyway. But it served a domestic political agenda rather than actually cared about ordinary people like Cho Cho Win.
And sometimes it just feels good to be able to speak against injustice, even if the process of doing that doesn't lead to the results you might like to see.
No, it was all about posturing, and it's about for a domestic political agenda, and I it's pretty reprehensible in any situation. But in the case, here is a concrete outcome. And then I also spent a lot of time talking to a family inside Burma, all HIV positive. The husband died, and getting that story, but again, died directly as a result of these sanctions. Again, sanctions generally hit the poorest and the least able to. It doesn't really affect the people who are in power, really. I mean, it may be an annoyance for them, but I don't think it makes any difference. And the Burmese then didn't really care, and the West had such little leverage with them anyway. It was all about posturing. They all looked good when they said, "Yeah, we support Aung San Suu Kyi," without having to lift a finger. It was not. It's not their necks on the line. But again, that was another thing that really bothered me about Burma, is it was being used as a platform by Western leaders to sound good. Have the photograph taken with Suu Kyi, very cynical.
Moving on now to your last chapter, chapter 7. This is a chapter that is covering what must have been happening just as your book was going to print, because the previous six chapters are basically the accumulation of your photojournalism travel experience in Burma, culminating in the insights and profiles that you have. Chapter 7 is about the start of the opening up period, the year it was published. There must have been even uncertainty in your mind, and in because that was the case. That was really the discussion going on at the time: is how real is this? What are we to make of it? What is really happening? So you're having to take all those ideas before they're really fully formed and somehow bring them into a chapter as it's going to print, I imagine. What can you say about that chapter?
It's short. I think, well, the chapter is about, I did sort of say that the military is still in control. Yeah. Let's not forget, for whatever changes are made, let's make sure they're not, cosmetic. Again, which is the title for the book, Brave New Burma. Is it a cosmetic change? To what extent are we just shifting to a different kind of era of dictatorship where, maybe the population willingly is involved in their own oppression, as in Brave New World. Right. So that was the idea behind that. But I think there was genuine optimism, both for the most cynical people watching, and also obviously for Burmese. Suddenly there was movement. There seemed to be genuine movement. But I kept thinking, and again, this is easy to say, in hindsight, but I kept thinking, well, nobody's touching the military. What happens to the military? Also, what are we giving the military? What are the concessions to the military? What will they gain from making these changes, apart from the right thing to do? There needs to be much more than that. But then this sort of unholy alliance between the elites of Aung San Suu Kyi and the elite of the military, and then of course the Rohingya crisis, which, to my shame, I think I didn't spend nearly enough time on the Rohingya issue as I perhaps should have, and I should think that people who are much more familiar with it would give a much different reading from it, i.e. that the genocide was all ready, that was primed. It was just well, you could argue, I suppose, that genocide has been committed against the Rohingya not just once but numerous times. But that was that was after my book came out that really ramp up in Rakhine State. But I think it was just until you actually really deal with the military in a meaningful way, and not just from the point of view of getting them back in the barracks, but actually giving them incentives to stay there. What do they get out of this process? That was important. As loathsome it may be to the more sort of self-righteous amongst us, that had to be a major consideration, because if you're going to bring about any meaningful change, they, again, going back to what I said earlier, they needed to be a part of the process. But again, I'm just an onlooker, and I don't fully know. But I think at that time, I think everyone was optimistic, cautiously optimistic, that these changes were going to bear some real fruit. I don't think it was anybody really knew what was going to happen. But again, I always think that us as outsiders, what do we really know about these parts of the world? These countries that we spend a lot of time in. You try and sort of transmit what you see and try and make sense of it. But I don't know. I think Burma, we did get it very wrong, indeed.
How so?
Well, I think perhaps again, perhaps with the Rohingya crisis, I think that was a real turning point. I think for perception in the west of Burma. Yeah. Suddenly, it was a real mess. Yeah. But actually, it was probably in terms of the Burmese crisis, that part of it was incredibly well documented, well covered by journalists, from Reuters to the freelancers like myself. And yet the world did nothing. Nobody lifted a finger. So I guess it made me think about the limitations of what I was doing. Thinking that no matter how much you may gain in terms of an understanding of a place and what you learn along the way, that actually it doesn't really matter. It did really make me think, what on earth am I doing here at all? What am I doing with photography? What am I doing with this? All of those sort of things. Yeah, I just thought, and also at that time I thought, what? It's not really my place. There are plenty of really great Burmese photographers and journalists who are young and they've got the energy and the drive to really do this justice. What am I doing here? I'm not adding anything to it. So that was my feeling toward the end of that. But again, like I say, as long as the military were left unmolested or at least, stood back a bit, then I thought the possibility of resurgence of military rule was a very ever-present reality. And with Aung San Suu Kyi kind of on their side, as it were, I suppose, it was a kind of almost a fait accompli. They've outmaneuvered everybody.
So were you not surprised by the military coup in 2021?
No, I think I was surprised. I think most people were, weren't they? I mean, you must have been.
Yeah.
But not just the coup, but the violence of the coup, the kind of we are not taking prisoners. I mean, they are just, and the level of torture, and we're all very well documented as well.
Once they started it, I think this is where it had to go.
It just seemed like a free for all. I mean, suddenly the houses being raided by soldiers and shooting their guns off in the middle of Rangoon in the middle of the night. It's just terrifying. So if you imagine that's going on in Rangoon, what on earth is going on in the other parts of the country that we don't have access to? I just wish I had something positive to say, but I really don't. It's the reality. I don't follow it as much as I used to, because I feel that my time and my usefulness, as in a purpose, i.e. fulfilling a role that a Burmese couldn't. Now Burmese can clearly do it far better. That's over. I sort of step back a bit, but I don't think I have anything particularly useful to add to what's going on. But the only thing I would say is that I have come across a few articles written by people who I can remember talking to when I was in my 20s about how PDF of this and the military of that, and I just think, look at the Arakan army. They've all committed horrific atrocities, cutting off heads and so on.
So you're referring back to this reductionist good and evil.
Yeah, so I remember reading a piece, but I can't remember, some woman, I think she's based somewhere on the Burma border with Thailand, talking about, it just seemed to be a very clear, the forces of good and democracy and righteousness on one side and the evil empire on the other. And of course, again, I'm not saying that's not true in broadly speaking, but I think it's really messy. I think it's much more messy than before. I think there's so much more information you're getting than they used to. So you'd hear about things, atrocities committed by the military in the old days, and maybe one or two by ethnic armies. But now you're seeing, I think it's there's a much more information on those sort of stories from all sides now. But also, most of the country seems to be pretty unstable. So the final, a lot has happened since the book came out. But as I say, it came out at a time when people didn't want to know. They didn't want to think about the past and what the past might be. Everyone wants to, understandably, you can understand that. But I think it's more, again, about the West protecting what it wanted, the stories that it wanted to hear, rather than actually engage with the complex, messy reality of it.
So we've gone through the 7 chapters of your book, Brave New Burma, again, which we encourage listeners to check out. Often when we do these interviews with authors, I hear back from listeners saying, that was so fascinating. I went out and got the book and read through it. I wanted to dig into it. And this is a book we definitely recommend for that, to find where you can get a copy of this, because we're just barely scratching the surface of stories. And of course, photographs are photographs. That's a different order altogether. Through your journalistic work and your photojournalism and your extensive time in Burma, did you ever feel unsafe, or did you ever run through personal dangers yourself?
Not knowingly, I don't think so. I mean, this is the funny thing, is I remember meeting a Thai journalist here, photographer, and he'd gone across the border into Burma. And I'm not a war photographer. I mean, I'll say that from the outset. I don't have any stomach for it. This guy had ended up in a gun battle lasting several hours, I think. And he came up to me with utter admiration, thinking I'd obviously spent 20 years under fire like that. And I said, I don't think I've been shot at once in Burma. You know, poor guy. But again, I wasn't really looking, the purpose of journalism is to try and tell stories and get information, right? To try and sort of get a grip of something. I don't think getting shot at is the qualification. But I don't think so. I mean, again, any fears that you may have, things that very sort of marginal things like your film being taken off you, that sort of thing. That was the fear that worried me the most. And I remember putting like rolls of film in the toilets in a plastic bag and things like that. It's just ridiculous lengths I used to go to. Yeah. But it was fine. Nothing ever bad ever happened. It was more concern for the people around you, because you knew that obviously the consequences are far more severe. But just the one thing I did want to mention was that from the soldiers from within, the enemy within, that chapter, is that I spent a lot of time with a former Burmese soldier who had been blown up and lost several limbs and fingers and his eyesight, or one eye at least, and then self-educated himself on Burmese history and joined Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy and persuaded soldiers in 1988 to join the forces of democracy, and as a result, he was, taken away and put in solitary confinement and tortured very badly for, I don't know, something like 15 years in prison. So he'd actually done something really bad, which is betray the military by persuading members of the military to join against the military dictatorship. But again, this whole idea that it's a monolithic monster of an army, I think is again reductionist and simplistic. But that's really what I was trying to get at in the book, was that when you start to look at things in a bit more detail, you realize that these kind of stereotypes that one has start to sort of melt, and a much more complicated, rich picture is left behind. And I hope that was the case with Brave New Burma. But again, like I say, I think it was the casualty of a great deal of optimism. So that sounds bad, doesn't it?
What's that?
A casualty of optimism.
Well, it's the history. I mean, it's the reality that we have to look on and talk about. Yeah. So the other piece of media that you've done that also brings in your work and reporting time in Burma is Burma Soldier. This is the HBO feature documentary. Can you talk about what this documentary was about?
Yeah, I mean, so whilst doing research for my book, in fact, I was trying to find a way to raise the finance to complete the book. And I approached somebody I knew who was a film producer, and I said, look, I'm trying to find funds to complete this book. Do you have any ideas? So she said, well, if you come back with an idea for a film, then maybe I can help you. So Burma Soldier was born out of my book, Brave New Burma. So I said, well, look, I met this amazing former Burmese soldier on the Thai-Burma border. He's a refugee, and his story is extraordinary because he joined the army just like many young men do from an impoverished background. He was then sent off to the front line, where he got blown up during the middle of a battle and landed in a minefield, lost several limbs and one eye. And as a result, he was discharged from the army, and he began to educate himself about his history and the history of Burma and why Burma is constantly at war. And he realized that the problem, we had to change the military. And in 1988, he joined the protest movement, where he persuaded, marching up and down the streets of Rangoon, calling for democracy and a change of government, and managed to persuade members of his military to join the side of the people and also take part in this uprising. As a result of which, when the crackdown came, they came after him and he was arrested. He was very badly tortured and put in solitary confinement for years. Once he was finally released from prison, he fled to the Thai-Burma border, which is where I met him. And he was working with former political prisoners in exile in Thailand at the time. And it was his story which would provide the basis. Because like I said earlier, people in the West knew nothing about the military except that they were to be condemned. That's as far as the understanding, I think, really went. I was trying to bring in, well, hang on a minute, the military is actually comprised of people. And he's one of them. He has the most extraordinary story because he does this complete, about face. Yeah. And I thought that would make a compelling basis for a documentary film. So that's how it came about. And so we filmed him literally about a week before he left the refugee camp to go to the States, which is to be reunited with his family, because they'd all fled and they were all in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So we had about a week in which to film in the refugee camp to get his story down in as much detail as possible and put together, film for HBO. So that's how that came about. Yeah.
Right. That's wonderful. And again, that's Burma Soldier for those that subscribe to HBO or want to try to catch that documentary in another way. The book is Brave New Burma. Are there other media or projects you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I'm always, I don't know. I'm always sort of trying to find, the thing is I'm always trying to find support for projects which are, generally, they're either underreported, misrepresented or ignored very often. So I've gone very different now. I've got many interests, not just journalism and photography, but I'm trying to work on a book about my own story, if you like, which is returning to the place I was born, which is Ireland. And I began photographing a 17th century battlefield when I was a kid at school. And that was really an early beginning for a later career as a photographer. So I've returned back to that battlefield. I currently have an exhibition in the west of Ireland in Galway about this battle, and it's a jumping off point to try and understand something of your own identity. If you've spent any time in Burma, you are forced to confront your own identity. You're often asked where you're from. And of course, identity runs central to the whole crisis in Burma, So in turn, it sort of caused me to think about stories. Well, what story can I tell? What is my story to tell? And this is the story that... So it's about looking at family history. It's looking about identity, where you come from. Although I'm Irish, I speak with a very British accent, that's exploring all of those things. People often say to me, well, you don't sound Irish, so on. So yeah, it's an exploration. But again, like most of my projects, they tend to not fall into neat categories, so make it difficult for marketing people. So therefore, the funding isn't always readily, coming in. But yeah, so a departure really, and also to draw on some of the experiences of the past and trying to photograph stuff, make sense of things, understand identity, which is, it's such an interesting subject. And in the West, whilst I've been away all these years, identity has raised its head in a very different kind of way, with identity politics and things, which I don't fully understand. But coming from spending time in Burma and elsewhere, you realize that the identity has a very different meaning and very real consequences. So it's about exploring all of those kind of themes.
Thank you for staying with us for the duration of this interview. In a world where Myanmar's crisis has largely faded from the headlines, critical voices and perspectives are being left unheard. And that is where we hope to come in. Through this humble platform, we're trying to provide something unique, an opportunity to share important experiences, insights, struggles, and perspectives in depth, and in a way that few other media sources offer. Our content not only keeps the sputtering global conversation about Myanmar alive, but it also brings much needed attention to those now fighting for their very freedom and dignity. So if you value this work and the perspectives we're offering, please consider supporting us. Your contributions help us to continue to amplify these voices that matter and provide the world with the coverage of Myanmar that it so deserves. Visit insightmyanmar.org/donation to stand with us.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanang boda yaranang